All right, Rabosai, good morning, good morning, good morning, a good yar. Hopefully everybody had a beautiful and uplifting Yom Kippur. Baruch Hashem, we were zoche here to a very, very special day. Meretz Hashem Halavai should be our Yom Kippur, our tefillas, our tshuva, should be a schus for all of us and our mishpachas and Meretz Hashem in the year to come. I want to begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's daf, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Dr. Linda Weinberg, Sarah and Ricky Gratz, Julia, Rena, and Eve, in loving memory of their husband, father, and Zayda, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz, Moshe ben Avram, David. To thank Ayal and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the Sherman this month, and the schus of Rafua Shalema for Shulamis Bas Susha. To thank Adam and Yudit Ben Zev for dedicating the Shurim this month, and the schus of all of our tulos being the skabel on high. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Greg and Rachel Levitan, in commemoration of the first yahrzeit of Greg's mother, Esther Bas Herschel, and in honor of the organization Renewal, which facilitates kidney transplants through live kidney donation. Incredible. All right, well, so with that, let us begin. I feel compelled. It's a shorter daf today. That's we're able to get a little bit of a later start. I feel compelled just to mention something that I said at Shir here yesterday during the break that I don't want the rest of the chevra to miss out on. Yesterday's daf Tzadik Aleph in Maseches Kesuvos, was the yahrzeit daf of the Lubliner Rav, meaning Lubliner Rav passed away on Kesuvos daf Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis 91b. Obviously, it wasn't Yom Kippur when he passed away, but that was the daf of the Daf Yomi that he passed away. So his Talmidim, knowing that Daf Yomi was one of their Rebbe's most incredible accomplishments, the Talmidim tried to understand perhaps what is the deeper message embedded in that daf for them. And they found, of course, on Daf Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis 91b, the beautiful Gemara that says, Mitzvah al hayisomim lifroa chov avihen. That was the end of yesterday's daf. There is a mitzvah upon orphans to go ahead and pay off the debts of their father. And the Talmidim understood that this Gemara was talking to them. The Lubliner Rav didn't have children. He didn't have children, biological children. His Talmidim, his students were his children. And they understood that it was their sacred task to go ahead and carry forward their Rebbe's work, even though he was no longer alive in this world. And the students kept the Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, the Lubliner Rav's yeshiva, going until the Nazis, Yimach Shema V'Zichram, shut them down. That was the incredible commitment and debt they felt. They were the orphans. Their father incurred a debt. Opening up a yeshiva was no small task, especially the type of yeshiva that Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin was. It was unique in every single aspect, and they took it upon themselves to continue the work of their father. And last night, this is what I said over during Shir yesterday, last night as I was thinking about this even more, to take it a step further, I would say we're also those same children. Everyone who learns the daf is also a child of Rav Meir Shapira, of the Lubliner Rav. And as such, every single time that we go ahead and we learn the daf, day after Yom Kippur, Baruch Hashem, everybody's tired, everybody's spent, it's been such a overwhelming, spiritually draining last 10 days, draining in a beautiful way. But I felt last night they came home after Yom Kippur, and after Havdalah, it was like a wave of euphoria. Might also because I used wine for Havdalah. I was like, wow, everything is great. So it was fantastic, right? But then like a wave of exhaustion, but like a good exhaustion when you feel like you've been doing something good and meaningful, and you're just not an ounce of koach, and then to come the next morning, okay, granted 5 minutes later, Baruch Hashem, but to be able then to continue our sacred work, we are the Yisomim, we're also the orphans of the Lubliner Rav, and ultimately today and each and every day we continue to pay our father's debts. We should be Zocheh Meretz Hashem, that in the merit of our Torah, in the merit of our daf, Lubliner Rav's neshama should have a lichli Gan Eden, and he should be a melitz yosha for us in Shamayim. So with that, let us begin. So we are picking up today's daf at Tzadik Beis 92. We are picking up Hahu Gavra is where I left off yesterday, which was 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom. Hahu Gavra, the Zabna Luksuvasa Diime Bitovas Hana. So this is a very interesting case. This was a guy who sold off the ksuva of his mother. A real winner, right? He sold off the ksuva of his mother. Now, I would say she didn't know about it. She didn't know about it. See, here, just understand what he was doing. Right? Remember again, we've been dealing with the sugya of Kesuvos ben Dichrin. What does Kesuvos ben Dichrin say? What does it say? What happens ultimately again with the mother's ksuva? It goes to her son. So essentially, what the son is saying, look, is my mother's alive and well, right? My mother's alive and well. She's happily married. But lamaisa again, there's a possibility that at some point in time I'm going to be entitled to the ksuva. So halacha lamaisa, he's selling a future right. Now, I will say, interestingly enough, he says, but I'm just telling you that if my mother comes along, look at Rashi for just a moment. First of all, the Zabn L'Ksuva Di'ime, Shaisen Esua La'acher, Umachar Ksuva Sabechaye Baila. So Rashi said, B'tovas Hana, fine. So what happens? But the son says that if my mother comes and objects to the sale and voids the sale, I'm not achroi to you. In other words, I will say, so this is what we call a sale with achrayas. Sale with achrayas. I'm selling you a future right. If for some reason my mother comes and objects, it's your problem. You're left holding the bag. I'm not refunding your money. I'm nothing. Look at Rashi. So if my mother comes and objects to the sale, I'm just telling you the sale stands. I'm not refunding you your money. So you're no ksuva and no money. So what happens? We'll say this is incredible. Shchiva ime, so ultimately the mother passes away. And she never went ahead and objected to the sale of the ksuva. Okay. Va'asa ihu v'kama arer. Now we'll say this is very interesting. Now what happens? The son came along, and he objected to the sale. So we'll say, so what? Look at Rashi. Asi'iv v'kama arer. Lomar ani tachas imi omed ve'etlanu va'afamos la'achzir. So we'll say now the mother passes away, which means now the son becomes entitled to inherit the ksuva. And what does he do? He objects to the sale. He says, righteous indignation. I can't believe someone stole my mother's ksuva. It was me, right? So Lamaisa now, again, I object to the sale. And he's coming now kind of as the shaliach of his mother, right? In this, not the shaliach, but in the place of his mother, because he's the inheritor. So now I will say, Reuven is the very guy who sold the ksuva to Shimon, right? He said, if my mother objects to it, the sale is void, and I'm sorry, no achrayas. Mother passes away, never objects to it. Reuven comes along and objects to the sale. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Sava Rami Bar Chama Le'Meimar Ihu b'makom imei koi." So Rabbi Chama said, "Listen, the truth is he's halachically justified in that because he's kind of coming in the place of his mother. His mother would have had the right to go ahead and object to the sale. He has the right to object to the sale." All right, so the Gemara says, "Amalei Rava, no. Nihid achrayis dida lo kabil alei." Achrayis didei mi lo kabel. So the Rava comes along and says, no. When Reuven sold the ksuva to Shimon without achrayis, Rava will say, what does without achrayis mean? What does it mean? It means that if a third party comes along, right? In this case, the third party would have been the mother and objected to the sale. Reuven's saying, I don't take any responsibility for that. I don't take any responsibility for it. I will say, but what does Reuven take responsibility for? What does he take responsibility for? Himself. In other words, so Rava says, no. When you sell something without achrayis, what that means is, if something outside of me happens to this transaction, I am not held responsible. But you yourself cannot be the cause for the dissolution of the transaction. So if Reuven comes along and says, I'm coming in the stead of my mother to go ahead and dissolve the sale, you could do that, but then you have to refund the money as well. Which I will say, what an incredible musar. First day, what an incredible musar. You see, in life, the one thing you can't often be responsible for are the actions of others. The one thing I am always responsible for are my own actions. So, in other words, there could be no achrayis when it comes to someone else. I can't be achrayis for you to do. Well, so again, we even have this concept in halacha that sometimes, again, about what level of liability, in a legal sense, and it's true in a moral sense as well, what level of liability do parents have for the actions of their children? So again, halachically, that's a question Morally, perhaps again, religiously, it's a question. But even we know at a certain point in time, as much as I loved my child, at the end of the day, they're independent of me and their actions are going to be independent of me as well. At a certain point, that's both halachically as well as spiritually. But lamaisa, my own actions, I always have an achrayus for that. And I will say, what an incredible lesson to learn Matzeh Yom Kippur. Because so many times in life, the reason we make our mistakes is because we go ahead and we hold other people responsible for the outcome of my life. The buck of your life stops with you. What you do, what you don't do is your decision. Good actions, bad actions, your decision. And if we could actually live that way, taking full responsibility for who we are, what we do, how we act, then Amir Hashem, this will be a dramatic year. The Gemara goes right to another interesting case. Reuven sold a field to Shimon without achrayis. So once again, remember, we know what that term means. What does that mean? Reuven sells a field to Shimon, and I will say essentially, what does it mean without achrayis? What does that mean? That Reuven says, listen, I have creditors. He doesn't have to say it. In other words, if Reuven has creditors, and let's say again, Reuven owes Levi money, Reuven doesn't have cash, so Levi comes along and says, fine, I'll take one of the properties you sold after the date of our transaction. And if Levi were to go ahead and do that, so let's say again, Levi seizes the field that Reuven sold to Shimon, so ultimately again, Shimon has no recourse against Reuven. That's what it means to sell without achrayis. You're selling without recourse. So the Gemara says, "Va'asa Shimon umachar l'Reuven b'achrayis." It's such a good case. So we'll say, watch what happened over here. So Reuven sold the field to Shimon without achrayis. Shimon then sold the same field back to Reuven with achrayis. Okay, it's nothing wrong. It's the same field. They're just selling it back and forth. But the difference is now Shimon sold it back with achrayis. And what happened? So the Gemara says Shimon umachar l'Reuven b'achrayis, top of Tzadik Beis, va'asa balchov de Reuven v'katarif leminei. So now what happened? Reuven's creditor now seizes the field from Reuven. Okay, do you understand what happened over here? So right, Reuven sold the field to Shimon without achrayis. Shimon sold the same field back to Reuven with achrayis. Meanwhile, this field was already encumbered to Reuven's creditor. So now, after Reuven bought the field back from Shimon with achrayis, Reuven's creditor seizes the field. So both say, so now what's the shot? So now Reuven's creditor seizes the field. So both say, so what's the halacha? Dinahu the azul Shimon umaftzile. Both say ultimately again, what's the halacha? The halacha is that Shimon is on the hook. Right? Maftzile means that Shimon could go ahead and negotiate this with the creditor. In other words, Shimon sold Reuven a field with achrayis. The field was now seized. Right? Achrayis means you agree to make the party whole in the event that their field is seized. Shimon has to go ahead and make Reuven whole. Amar Rav says, what are you talking about? Mihida achrayis da alma kabilale. Achrayis did nafshe mi kabilale? No, that's not what achrayis means. Achrayis means to say once again, why is the field being seized? It's Reuven's creditor. So let me get this straight. By the way, to round out this case, let me add in one more piece of information. Reuven borrowed money. Right? We'll just call it from creditor. Okay, that's really the first step in this case. Reuven borrowed money. Then what happened? Then Reuven sold the field to Shimon, right? An encumbered field without achrayis. Then Shimon sold the same field back to Reuven with achrayis. And now what happens? Loan comes due. Reuven has no cash. So the lender, creditor, seizes the land from Reuven. Reuven shows up to Shimon, says, Shimon, you sold me a field with achrayis. A creditor took my field. You have to make me whole. So the first opinion says, Enachinami. That's what it means to sell achrayis. Rav comes and says, what are you talking about? That was Reuven's own creditor. When Shimon sells with achrayis means, listen, if someone comes for me, like one of my creditors comes and seizes your field, or maybe even some other external extraneous circumstance, but ultimately my pledge of achrayis does not cover your personal creditor. Right? Because we'll say, obviously, again, can you imagine what that would look like in the world of achrayis? If ultimately, again, the sale covered even the purchaser's personal circumstances, and therefore Rava says, when your personal creditor comes along and seizes the field, I have no achrayis for that. And I both say, that's how he paskin. So when Reuven's own creditor comes along and seizes the field, Reuven cannot come back to Shimon claiming any kind of achrayis. However, Umode Rava agrees Beruven she Yarash Sada Miyakov Umachra L'Shimon. All right, I should have gotten a chart to this. It's actually very straightforward. Stay away from charts, because charts, I feel like, give some people Yivamas PTSD. Right? So when they see charts, they get so it's actually very straightforward cases. So listen to this. Rava agrees. Get ready for this. Ruven sheyorash Sadam Yaakov. Ruven inherits a field from his father Yaakov. So his father Yaakov dies. Ruven inherits a field. Umachra l'Shimon, and now Ruven sold to Shimon. Shimon's not his brother, by the way. Shimon's just another guy. Right? Sells to Shimon. Now what happens? Shelo ba'achrayis. Without achrayis. Va'asa Shimon umachra l'Ruven ba'achrayis. And now what happens? Shimon sells it back. So we'll say it's a similar case. We're just adding in an additional level over here. Yaakov dies. Ruven, his son, inherits him. Good. Ruven has an inherited field. Ruven sells the field to Shimon without achrayis. Shimon sells it back to Ruven with achrayis. Okay, so far so good. The asa balchov diakov v'katarif leminei. What happens now? After Reuven bought it back with achrayis for Shimon, who comes along? A creditor of Yaakov, a creditor of deceased Yaakov, comes along and seizes the field from Reuven. So even Rava agrees that in that case, the azil Shimon umafzi leminei. In this case, Rabbi say the achrayis clause kicks in. In this case, the achrayis clause kicks in, right? And even though, again, in this case, the field was not seized by one of Shimon's creditors, but it was seized by an outside party. In other words, nothing to do with Ruvain. It's Ruvain's father's debt. Ultimately, again, then the achrayis clause would kick in. My timer, ba'chov diakov kibalchov da'amadami, because ultimately a creditor of Yaakov is like an outside party. So I will say, which you begin to see something very interesting, which I don't know that necessarily we have this sensitivity until we get to this daf, which is as follows. We've always heard of the concept of selling property with achrayis. We've always heard, right? We've always heard of that, right? Reuven sells a field to Shimon with achrayis. That means that Reuven takes responsibility should something happen to the field. The truth is, I always assumed that what does it mean if something happens to the field? That essentially what Reuven is saying is if one of my creditors comes along and seizes the field in satisfaction of one of my debts, I agree to make you whole. What has just happened over here is we have just dramatically expanded the concept, and I should say the coverage of achrayis. So suddenly, what does achrayis mean? When Reuven sells to Shimon with achrayis, what Reuven essentially is saying is what? If that field is seized by anyone, right, I agree to make you whole. The only exception in coverage is what? If Shimon, well, I'm using Shimon, right? If it's seized by your own creditor, right? Shimon the purchaser, if your own creditor seizes it, that I'm not making you whole for that, right? That's your problem. Shabbos say really dramatic, to the point that even over here, again, Yaakov died, Reuven inherited the property, Reuven sold to Shimon without achrayis. Shimon sold back to Reuven with achrayis. Okay, fine. Now creditor of deceased father Yaakov seizes the field from Reuven. Reuven has a right to trigger the achrayis clause, and ultimately Shimon would be obligated to make him whole. Incredible case. So let's go back to Reuven shemacha sadol Shimon ba'achrayis. See, here we go. Very interesting. Oh, fascinating cases. So what happened? Reuven sold the field to Shimon with achrayis. Okay. Reuven sold the field to Shimon with achrayis. V'zokif alav b'milva. Now, I'll say in this case over here, what happens? Reuven didn't have the cash to pay for the field. I'm sorry. Shimon didn't have the cash to pay for the field, right? So Reuven sold it to Shimon. Shimon didn't have the cash. So what happened? Not a problem. They structured the debt as a loan. So you have an outstanding debt. You have an outstanding loan to me. Okay. V'zokif alav b'milva. Umeis Reuven. Now, something interesting. Reuven died. So I'll say Reuven the seller. Reuven the seller died. And remember again, just to be clear, Reuven sold to Shimon with achrayis. Shimon didn't have the money, so there's a debt owed from Shimon to Reuven. Next step, Reuven dies. Meis Reuven. The asabachov the Reuven vekatarif lemi Shimon. So what happens, I will say? So now Reuven died and he had a creditor. Reuven's creditor comes to Shimon, right, and seizes the encumbered property that Shimon bought from Reuven. Okay, fine. Upaisi bizuze. Now in this case over here, what happened is Shimon didn't want to part with the property, so what did he do? He paid off the creditor in cash. Paid off the creditor in cash. Take a look at Rashi. Upaisei bezuzei. Paisei bezuzei is like if you have on your margin Likutei Rashi, it's right next to that. Paisei bezuzei b'maos demei asada shayachayev liyasmi. Payis es hanosha b'shil Ruven shevachayis machalo. So just to understand over here. So essentially, what did Shimon do? Remember, I will say Shimon owed money to Ruven, right? What was the money owed to Ruven? What was the money? The purchase price of the field. So now the creditor of deceased Ruvain comes to collect the field from Shimon. Shimon says, you know what? Here's what I'll do. I'll just pay you the money, right? I never paid Ruvain or his estate yet, so I'm just going to pay you, creditor. Here's the 1,000 zuz, right? Here's 1,000 zuz. Here it is. You're paid off, and essentially my debt is paid off as well. So instead of paying my debt to Ruvain or to his Yarshim, I'm now just paying it to you, creditor, and everyone's happy. Creditor has been paid. I've effectively paid for the land, and all is good. So the Gemara says, Dinahu, listen to this. Dinahu, the Amrune b'nei Ruvain. So we'll say the Yarshim, right? The Yarshim, Ruvain's inheritors, could come to Shimon, and they could say something amazing. They could say, Anan mitaltali shavak avun gabach. 1 second. Our father left metaltalin in your possession. I will say, now what metaltalin did Ruvain leave in Shimon's possession? What metaltalin? What metaltalin? Alone. Money. Money's metaltalin. Our father left metaltalin in your possession. Get ready for this. O metaltali liyasmi lebalchov lo mishtabdi. And let's say creditors have no claim against movable property of Yisomim. Creditors only have a claim against real property of Yisomim. So watch what happened over here. The Yisomim, now the descendants of Ruvain, could come along to Shimon and they could say, Shimon, you gave away our father's money to the creditor, and that was not correct. So therefore, you still owe us the money. You paid off the debt. The debts of our father only encumber real property of the estate. They don't encumber movable property, and money is movable property. Therefore, again, that money should have been returned to us. You had no right to give that to the creditor. Incredible. Amar Rava. So Rava says, Ipikeach. Okay, so I will say, now watch this. So now we're saying the Yisomim have the right ultimately again to go ahead and claim. So I will say, so essentially what would happen in this case is Shimon would now be out 1,000 zuz. Right? So he just paid to the creditor something that he really owed to the Yarshim, so the Yarshim could claim it back against him. Amar Rava says, Ipikeach idach. So if Shimon's smart, what could he do? Magviluhu neilayu ara, v'hadar gabiluhu minayu. So I will say, so ultimately, again, fine. What Shimon could just do is, okay, so here's what I'll do. I'll give you back the land. Yisomim, I'm giving you back the land. And right after he gives back the land to the Yisomim, what could he do? Take it right back. Why? Because remember again, Ruvain sold it to him, ba'achrayas. So essentially, if the Yisomim want to be sticklers, again, the Yisomim would be right. But if they want to claim, no, you still owe us the money, he say, you know what, I don't have money. Take the land back, right? Because ultimately, again, here, I shouldn't have paid you, right? Here's the land back. And then right after he gives it to them, he could take it back and seize it again, ba'achrayas. Incredible. We'll say, take a look at Rashi. Magbilei ara, kishetavua, last of the short lines. Kishetavua yisomim yifralan karka b'dimei hamos, v'hadar gabi minayhu b'shvil achrayas avihem. So that's what he could simply do, give the land back to the Yarshim, and then take it back right afterwards as a form of achrayas. Good. So let's go back. So the Gemara says, Ipikech magbilei nehila ara v'hadar gabi luminayu. Ki Rav Nachman, dam Rav Nachman ara baravua, yisomim shegavu karka b'chovas avihen, Bal chov chozer v'gova osamehen. Because we'll say, in accordance with Rav Nachman, in the name of Rabbi Barabo, who holds that if orphans went ahead and collected karka as a way of repayment of a debt of their father, creditors of the estate could go back and retake that property from them. So we'll say, so a very, very interesting case. Okay, so I want to point out also what's profound about these cases is just the halachic concepts that emerge from them as well. So this idea, for example, so we've already seen the concept of achrayas. We've already seen the limitation of achrayas coverage. Now what we're also seeing over here is that halacha l'maisa, only real property of Yisomim of an estate becomes encumbered to a debt, but movable property does not. Quite fascinating. Good. We've also seen that halacha l'maisa, creditors have the ability to go ahead, right? If Yisomim collect property as form of payment of debts to the estate, other creditors could come and take that property from the Yisomim. Incredible. Amar Rabba. Rabba goes weiter. Here we go. I said, Rabba, again, let me just to clarify just that last case, right? So Reuven sold property to Shimon. Just now we have the whole thing. Reuven sold property to Shimon with achrayus, right? Right? Shimon didn't have the money. It's now a loan due to Reuven. Reuven dies, okay? Creditor of Reuven comes to Shimon and says, I'm seizing the property in satisfaction of Reuven's debt. Shimon says, don't seize the property. Let me just give you the money. I owed the money anyway to Reuven. I'm just going to give you the money to pay off the debt. Sounds beautiful. Yisomim, children of Reuven, come to Shimon. You had no right to give away that money. That money belonged to us. And therefore, again, you still owe us the money. Why do you owe us the money? Because ultimately, again, metaltalin, movable property of the estate, is not meshubad, doesn't have a lien against it to the debts of the estate. Only real property of the estate has a lien against it. So therefore, the Yisomim are demanding that Shimon still repay the 1,000 zuz, which is a lot of money for land, but the 1,000 zuz ultimately to the estate. Shimon says, the Gemara says, you know what? Shimon says, forget it. Take the land back. Take the land back. You're right. Take the land back. And as soon as Shimon does that, then what? Then what? As soon as he gives the land back to the estate, then what? He has the ability to claw it back, utilizing his achrayus clause. Incredible. I'm sorry? Good. So therefore we'll say, so really incredible idea. Good. So we'll say, so let's go back to Amar Rabba. Reuven shemachar kol sadoso l'Shimon. So here we go. Reuven sold all of his property to Shimon, and what happens? V'chazor Shimon umachar sada'achas l'Levi. Shimon then went and resold one of those lands to Levi. So okay, Reuven sold all of his property to Shimon. Shimon took one piece of property and sold it to Levi. V'asa balchov de Reuven, and now it's fascinating. Now Reuven has a creditor. So we'll say, so the Gemara says, Ratza mizegova. Fascinating. So we'll say, now Reuven has a creditor. Who could Reuven, now we'll say, okay, we always have to add in like one more piece. Really the first step in this story is what? Reuven borrowed money. That's the first step. What happens when Reuven borrows money? What happens? Lien against all of his property. Okay, that's step one. Step two, Reuven sold all of his property to Shimon. Good. Step three, Shimon sells one parcel of land to Reuven, to Levi, sorry. Step four, Reuven's debt becomes due and he's cash poor. Now the Gemara says, okay, so now creditor has the right to go to either Shimon or Levi. Why, Abba? Say why? Why? Because all of those properties are encumbered by the lien of the original debt. So quite interesting. So we'll say, so what's the chiddush being espoused over here? And we're not up to halacha l'maisi yet, right? But again, what's fascinating about this is one would have thought that kind of like there's an order over here. First go to Shimon, but no, the Gemara says it's not true, because a lien is a lien is a lien. And it's the same lien on Shimon's property than it is on Levi's property. Therefore, the creditor could go to either Shimon or Levi in collection of the debt. So the Gemara, listen to this. Ratza mizegova. V'lo amran, this is only true, ela dizabna beinonis. And I both say, this is only true if Levi, right, the guy who purchased from Shimon, purchased beinonis. Okay, so I both say, by the way, this is why Kesuvos is shas cotton. Everything is here. In real estate, there are three grades of property. There is ziburis, beinonis, and idis. Ziburis is inferior property, beinonis, middle grade property, idis, superior property. In general, the halacha is that a bal chov is only entitled to collect from beinonis, or ziburis, right, but certainly not idis. So when do we say that in this case, creditor has the ability to go ahead and collect his debt either from Shimon or Levi? That's assuming that Levi, who only purchased one parcel of land, purchased beinonis. In other words, the type of property that is suitable for collection. Aval zabna idis v'ziburis. But if he went ahead and he bought idis or ziburis, matzi amrale lahachi tarchi uzebini ara delo chazilach. So we'll say this is incredible. But if Levi bought either idis or ziburis, right? Best quality, lowest quality, he could say to Reuven's creditor, you have no right to collect from me because this is dafka why I bought this grade of property so as to be exempt from any seizures because of creditors. Shabbos say, it's incredible, by the way, that it could very well be according to this, like even on the real estate market, not only were people careful to look for liens like a title search, but what's also interesting is maybe to be makbid to buy a certain grade of property, so that even if you are buying without achrayus, right, or with achrayus, doesn't really matter. If you're buying idis or idis or ziburis, again, no creditors will be able to come after you, which is really quite fascinating. So again, when we say that creditor has the right to collect from either Shimon, who bought all of the properties from Levi, from Ruvain, or Levi, who bought a property from Shimon, that's only assuming that Levi bought Beinonis. But if Levi didn't buy Beinonis, ultimately you can say, leave me alone, right? Leave me alone. To which the Gemara says, Ubeinonis nami lo amran, ela de lo shavik beinonis te kavasa. Furthermore, again, I will say, ultimately, again, and even when it comes to Beinonis, right? Even if Levi did buy Beinonis, we only allow the creditor to collect Beinonis from Levi if what? If he did not leave, if Shimon does not have any similar Beinonis. De lo shavak Beinonis te kavasa. Aval. Oh, what a beautiful daf, right? What a beautiful daf. Aval, could have started 6:30, right? Aval shavak beinonis te kavasa. But if at the end of the day he left behind suitable beinonis, matzi amarle hinachti lecha makom ligbos hemenu. I left you a place from which to ultimately go ahead and collect. So I will say, so what's interesting to note is as follows over here. So the Gemara seems to say, so if you take a look, yeah, fine. So I'll say, so ultimately, the Gemara seems to give this interesting qualification, which is that halacha l'maisa, if even if Levi does have beinonis, but if Shimon also has beinonis, that Levi could claim, why are you coming to me first? Ultimately, you should go to Shimon first. So we'll say, so what kind of began as a very expansive statement that, again, so let's just go through the case once more. Reuven owns property, sells all of his, step one, Reuven borrowed money, right? He has encumbered property, sells all of his encumbered properties to Shimon. Shimon sells a property to Levi. Creditor comes along, Reuven has no cash. So now the Gemara says, well, the creditor could collect from either Shimon or Levi because everything is encumbered. So that began as a very expansive statement. Now suddenly, again, we've really limited it. So it's only true, number one, if what? If Levi bought Beinonis, and also if there's no similar Beinonis left in Shimon's portfolio. But if there is similar Beinonis left in Shimon's portfolio, Levi could say to the creditor, you really should go to him before you go to me. Okay, so the Gemara says, listen to this. Amar Abaye, another case, really fascinating cases. Amar Abaye, Ruvain shemachar sada l'Shimon ba'achrayis. Here we go. Right, Ruvain went ahead and sold the field to Shimon with achrayis. The asa balchov de Ruvain, the katarif leminei. All right, so this seems to be a pretty straightforward case, right? Once again, step one, Ruvain borrowed money, right? That's step one. Step two, he sold a field to Shimon with achrayis. Step three, loan comes due. Step four, the balchov, the creditor, comes along and seizes the field from Shimon. The katarif leminei. So dinahu, so we'll say, listen to this. Dinahu, the azel Ruvain umaf tzilei. So we'll say, listen to how fascinating this is. So now, loan comes due, Reuven doesn't have any money on him. Okay, fine, so no problem. It's encumbered property, so what does creditor do? Creditor goes to Shimon to go ahead and seize the field. Seems pretty straightforward. The halacha will say is that Reuven could intervene and try to work something out with the creditor. Right? Reuven, the borrower, could intervene and try to work something out with the creditor. And Rabbi said, now what's the chiddush with that? The chiddush is, v'lo matzi amar le lav bal dvarim didiat. See, Rabbi said, the creditor could potentially say to Reuven, leave me alone. I'm not negotiating with you, right? I came to you, I asked you for repayment, you didn't have repayment. That's why ultimately, again, we did the loan with achrayis. So now ultimately at the end, everyone has achrayis, right? That's why I'm coming to now seize the property. So we'll say, so again, if creditor wants to say to Reuven, we're done, you and I are done. Now I'm just seizing the property from Shimon. Reuven has a right to say, no. Let's first see if an alternative approach can be worked out or not. Let's see if an alternative approach can be worked out. And ultimately, again, the creditor can't say to Reuven, I have nothing to do with you. Now, I will say, now, why would the creditor say to Reuven, I have nothing to do with you? Why? Because again, at the end of the day, you have no money, right? So I'm seizing the property and satisfaction of our debt. You and I have nothing more to talk about. Why? Because what could Reuven say? Mishum da Amr lei the mifkas mine the mafkas mine alai hadar. Because we'll say Reuven says, no, you do have a lot to do with me, and I am still very involved in this debt. Do you know why? Because when you go ahead and you seize the property from Shimon, guess who coming to pay a visit to first? He's coming to me. So I'm very much involved in this. So therefore, again, I have a vested interest in trying to see if something else can be worked out. Look at Rashi. The mafkis mine alai hadar. When you take it from him, he's going to come to me. Masha'ata motzi mimenu yachzor alai. So we'll say the chiddush over here. This is not a chiddush. Just the interesting point over here is one would have thought that after the loan comes due and Reuven doesn't have money anymore, that at the end of the day, Reuven is kind of removed from the transaction. And therefore, again, he has no mouth, right? He has no voice anymore in this transaction. Kamashman, that's not the case. Kamashman, that halacha lemaisa, again, he always has a voice in the transaction for the simple reason that when the creditor comes and seizes the property from Shimon, now again, Shimon is going to come back to Reuven. Therefore, Reuven has a vested interest in trying to work something out with the creditor. Beautiful. So the Gemara says, if you could an alternate version of this, fascinating. It will say this would be true even if Reuven sold the field to Shimon, shelo ba'achrayis. Now I will say, this is interesting. So watch this case, right? Reuven borrowed money. Obviously, the loan creates an encumbrance on the field, right? Reuven sells the field to Shimon without achrayis. Reuven can't pay the loan. Creditor comes to seize the field from Shimon. So if you're Reuven, you're thinking to yourself, okay, right? In other words, right? That lemaisa, again, there's no achrayis. Okay, I'm sorry, but there's no achrayis. Even in that case, the Gemara says Reuven has a right to intervene, right, and say to the creditor, let's work something through, right? There's no achrayis. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So the Gemara says, why? I don't want Shimon to be braggis with me. Like, I know halachically, you creditor have the right to seize the property from him, and if you do, he has no recourse against me. He has no legal recourse. I don't want him to be braggis. It's very simple. In other words, Reuven says, I do business in the community, right? Even though, again, I'm right, I'm correct, I don't want, obviously, Shimon is not going to have positive feelings towards me if my creditor comes and seizes his field. So I don't want him being braggis with me, and therefore, Allah Chalamaisa, he's permitted to intervene. I will say, when we say permitted to intervene, what that just means is creditor can say to Reuven, I'm not talking to you. Right? I would have thought before this sugya, once Reuven, if you don't have money, I'm not talking to you. There are plenty of people that live like that, by the way, right? If you don't have money, I'm not talking to you, right? So let's say, so again, I would have said creditor would say, right? If you don't have money, I'm not talking to you. You're in other words, you're no longer a party to this transaction. You've absented yourself because you have no money. Now my din is only with Shimon. What the Gemara is teaching us is that is not the case. Reuven is still a party to the transaction because Reuven has a vested interest. If he sold with achrayis, he has a vested interest in working something out because he doesn't want Shimon coming back to him. And even if he didn't sell ba'achrayis, he has a vested interest in Shimon not being braggis with him. So therefore, again, creditor has to listen to Reuven. Now again, if they can't work out an equitable solution, obviously what? So creditor has the right to seize the land. Now what will happen will happen. But Lamaisi has to at least give Reuven an opportunity to try to make things right. Incredible. So Amar Abaye, last line of Tzadik Beis Mabeis, Reuven shemachar sada l'shimon shelo ba'achrayis. Listen to this, fascinating. V'yatzu alav asikin. Here's the case. Reuven sold a field to Shimon, and I will say before they find, well, we'll see. And what happens? Yatzu alav asikin. Yatzu alav asikin. Look at Rashi. Tap Rashi Tzadik Gimel Amud Aleph 93a. Asikin Orin. So what's happening over here is like this. Reuven sold the field to Shimon. And what happens as they're finalizing this transaction, so people begin, there are people who come out of the people object to the sale. Why do they object to the sale? Because there are people who are claiming that the field doesn't really belong to Reuven, the field doesn't come, whatever complaints they're lodging. The point is there's mumbling during the sale, more than mumbling. There's objections during the sale that this is not a correct sale. This field is not really Reuven's to sell. Okay? Achlo hichsik ba, yachal lachzer ba. So this is very important halacha. Up until the point that Shimon has actually done a formal kinyan and acquired the property, he could back out of the transaction. back out, which I'll say, so again, in other words, one might have thought that maybe in a real estate transaction, once you go ahead and you come to terms, you set a purchase price, you do what has to be done. Perhaps, again, halacha l'maisa, that you can't back out afterwards. Kamash malon, though. Kamash malon, up until the point that the transaction has been finalized, you could back out. You could back out. Misheher sigba, eni yachal achzerbo. So we'll say at the end of the day, once the kinyan has been done, then Shimon cannot back out. Shimon cannot back out. I will say why. This is very interesting. Mishum the Amarle Chaysa Dikatiri Savris Vekabilos. I will say it's interesting. Literally again, Chaysa Dikatiri means a bag of knots you have accepted. I will say it's one of those expressions that works much better in the Aramaic than it does in the English translation. A bag of knots was an expression of, like, sometimes, listen, when you buy, it's buyer beware. Buyer beware, right? In other words, listen, you bought it, you bought it. Okay, this guy's objecting, whatever it is, this is what you bought, you can't back out. You made a kinyan, there's nothing more to talk about. The Gemara says, by the way, ume'emas machsigba, at what point in time do we say that a kinyan has been made? In other words, we'll say, when is the transaction finalized? Michidayesh HaMitzri. So we'll say, it's actually interesting, not our sugya, but there are different kinyanim that are made to acquire real estate. One of the ways in which you acquire real estate is you walk the borders of the land. If you walk the borders, and I will say, by the way, where do we learn this kinyan from? This was Avram Avinu. When he comes into Eretz Yisrael, he walks the borders. Miraculously, he walked the borders of Eretz Yisrael. That's how he was Kona Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Ikadar, we'll say, others say, so we'll say, so again, I just want to point out over something very interesting. So in this case over here, I will say, the first way this was set up, Abayi said, is Reuven is selling a field to Shimon without achrayas. So now what happens? They're ready to sign and seal. And there's a seeking, there's mumbling that the field doesn't really belong to Reuven. So now the shaila is, what are Shimon's rights? So the Gemara says, very simple. As long as he did not yet make the kinyan, he could back out of the transaction. The moment, ultimately, again, he did not make the kinyan, the moment he made the kinyan, he's in. And Reuven says to him, listen, you bought a bag of knots. But I would say, that's another exception also. When you buy a field without achrayas, to a certain degree, what you're also setting yourself up for is what? Potential loss. Reuven can say, Shimon, listen, you bought a bag of knots. That's what it means to buy a field without achrayas. Now we'll say, let's finish up. Watch this. There are others who explain, afilu ba'achrayas nami. We'll say this is true even if Shimon bought the field with achrayas. So we'll say, listen to this, because watch this. Here, fascinating. It's very exciting. So Reuven sells the field to Shimon with achrayas. So let's play this out. Reuven sells the field to Shimon with achrayas. So now what happens? Asikin come up, right? Right? People are objecting. And I will say, it's not just objection. People are raising like legitimate concerns if this is really Reuven's field or not. So obviously, if Shimon did not go ahead and if Shimon did not make the kinyan, then ultimately, again, there's nothing to discuss. He could back out. What if he made the kinyan? So I will say, I would have thought that maybe in a case of achrayas, Shimon should be able to back out. Why should he be able to back out? Because Shimon can say to Reuven, listen, Reuven, let's save ourselves both a lot of trouble. Because what's going to happen? You're going to go ahead, right? The asikin, someone is going to come and seize the fields from me. And when they seize the field from me, what's going to be the halacha? You're going to have to make me whole. So let's just save ourselves both the trouble and just give me back my money now. So Reuven can say to Shimon, Da'amarle, achdi tirfach v'ashalemecha. You know what? When the property is seized, come back and talk to me. So I'll say, again, so just to be clear, what's fascinating about this is, as long as the kinyan has not been made, even though they agreed to all the other terms, so buyer has the ability to walk away. Once the kinyan has been made, even if it's a case of achrayas, so we know that Shimon's going to get back his money. He only could claim his money back ultimately once the property is seized. Rabosai, shkoyach. What a daf.
Last name too. The other cases, everybody knows what's going on. They just, you sell down at point, you sell the field for a little bit less.